Swanee reporting for PotentNews.com. It's July 2nd. We're in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, downtown, and protesting against the Syrian invasion and aggression looming against Iran. Here's one of the organizers of this anti-war protest here. What's your name, sir?
My name is Isaac Sini.
Okay.
This has been organized by a number of different organizations, No Harbor for War, other concerned Haligonians as individuals against what they see as another Western military intervention that's planned for the Middle East, that whatever the problems that are faced in countries like Syria and Iran, it's up for those people without foreign intervention to determine the destinies of their own countries. Western intervention can only be, as has been demonstrated in Iraq, Afghanistan, and historically, is not for the advancement of the causes of the people, but for furthering the selfish, the narrow interest of various corporate monopolies. It's about rendering the resources of those countries for exploitation by those corporations. It's about using those countries as geopolitical pawns in a strategic attempt to redivide the world. And so it's a very dangerous situation. And we're here protesting simply because we want Canada to be a force for peace in this world. The Harper regime, the Harper dictatorship has been actively participating with U.S. imperialism in terms of joining U.S. plans, U.S. arrangements in this new redivision of the world. And we say no. We say not in our name. We say Canada should be a factor for peace. Canada should uphold international law. It should not participate in illegitimate, illegal interventions in other countries of the world. And so we're very concerned. An intervention at this stage with the kind of contradictions we have in the world would not only be disastrous for the people of Syria, for the people of Iran, for the people of the region, i.e. the Middle East, but would be disastrous for the world. We're teetering on the edge of another great crime against peace. We're teetering on the edge of a tremendous calamity that faces the world's peoples. So we are here trying to, to give our voice against intervention, saying hands off Syria, hands off Iran. Let's make Canada a factor for peace in the world. Let's create a world where peace and justice can prevail.
What do you make of the recent downing of that jet, the Turkish jet over Syrian airspace?
Well, the downing of the jet on June the 2nd, whether the jet had violated Syrian space or not, the issue is being used as a pretext, right, to justify intervention, to justify the unjustifiable. This is unacceptable, right? In a world in which we talk about, in which we become a modernized world where we're supposed to have rule of law and so forth, surely when events like this happen, right, we can find peaceful means by which to resolve the disputes. We say no to the use of force to resolve problems between and within nations. We believe these things should be resolved, in modern means, simply by following international law and so forth. As time has shown, quite often things like a downing of a jet or other sort of incidents are used as pretexts to launch what can only be seen to be massive military interventions that are not to solve any particular problems in the country, but to advance the malicious interests of particular imperialist powers. One of the clear examples, obviously, is the 1965 Gulf of Tonkin resolution, where Lyndon Johnson used what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, like an event where North Korean ships were supposed to have attacked a a U.S. ship, and this was used to expand presidential powers to wage unrelenting war against North Vietnam. What it turned out was it was actually, a falsified event that has been demonstrated by historians, right? So when the question comes up is we always have to be wary of these kind of events. But above all, whether one doesn't discover until years later what happened in a particular event or not, we all have to stand up for international law. We all have to stand with the fact that we should not in any way sanctify force as being the legitimate means by which we can resolve the contradictions between and within states and so forth. I mean, surely we've entered the 21st century. Surely these medieval concepts of might makes right, that force is the means by which we resolve problems in and between and within countries and so on, should have been put into the trash bin. So in a sense, we're going through a tremendous retrogression, not only in terms of international international law, not only in terms of might makes right, not only in terms of those who have the military power and whatever wherewithal imposing their will on other countries, but we see it within Canada with the attack, and in the United States and across the world with the attack on social programs, with the attack on the rights of people to have claims on the society, to provide them with a living, to provide them with support, to provide them with the basic needs that human beings need. So we're living in a terrible time of retrogression, and this possibility, this threat of intervention in the Middle East, particularly in Syria and Iran, that hangs over our head, is probably the most glaring example of this retrogression.
I've heard that that Syria is only a target to weaken Iran and to sort of encircle Russia and China. What do you make of that? And also, if you could comment on anything with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which I think China might be a part.
Well, I mean, there's other people who can comment in much greater detail, but it doesn't take a tremendous amount of research to demonstrate that what the U.S. has been doing, and one of the plans with Iraq, when the U.S. intervened in Iraq in 2003, this Western coalition, was that Iran was its central target. Whatever one may think of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, whatever one's religious beliefs are, whatever one's attitudes to, whether clerics and so forth should play a central role in running a government, what stands out clearly in the history is that when the bloody dictatorship of the Shah was overthrown, when he had been imposed, he was an ally of the United States. When Iran achieved independence in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, the U.S. set out as a central aim of the core of its global strategy was the ouster of that regime and the return of U.S. tutelage and hegemony in that particular country. And so when one reads through and looks at the documents that have been put out by the Pentagon and commentaries by other analysis, they made it very clear that Iraq was in a sense a stepping stone to Iran. And Syria at this particular juncture is seen specifically as being a very critical step in basically intervention in Iran and establishing Iran as basically as a dependent satellite of the United States. Many people have written articles in the New York Times and other places that the road to Tehran runs through Damascus. And part and parcel of this as well is also the encirclement of China by U.S. military bases. Recent papers and publications by the Pentagon has said that the main challenge to the United States primacy as the world's dominant power will come from China. So China has been signaled out. So what we are seeing is very dangerous problems developing, contradictions developing on a world stage where U.S. imperialism, in order to preserve its role as the primary dominant power in the world, is prepared to wage wars to basically recolonize in its name, areas that were colonized by other powers, so as to put pressure on what it sees as its imperial rivalries. And for example, in this map here, you can see, as it relates to Iran, you can see U.S. bases that encircle Iran. Iran is seen as being part of the sphere of, or the orbit, or being very closely linked to Russia and China. And so the U.S. sees it as very important to advancing their interests against Russia and China by basically not only toppling the government of Iran, but establishing its control there. So we live in a very dangerous time, and there are other people here, for example, who can talk in much more detail about very specific arrangements and things that have unfolded. What I'd like to stress is we live in a very, very dangerous time in human history. We face this calamity of war, which is hanging over our head, crime against peace, a violation of international law. We face climate change. We face the attack on social rights across the world and so forth. So this is extremely delicate, precarious moment we're living in. And so one of the things we want to say is not in our name. There will be no crimes of peace in our name. And we're calling on the Canadian people, in a sense, to make themselves conscious to overcome the disinformation that comes as a torrent in the media, whether it's in the newspapers or it's on television and so forth, that they make their voice heard for peace, and that they try their best to stay the hands of the warmongers and once more, in a sense, make a very important contribution to ensuring that the 21st century is not a century of war, but a century of peace, a century of justice, a century of equality and equity.
Now,
Gary, he would know a lot more about this stuff.
Now, the fact that there are so few people that showed up to this, what would you say to the people who would say that that's depressing? And I mean, I'm hearing, I might have read a report that said that Netanyahu was determined to strike Iran around November or October. Yeah. If that is the case, do you think this is depressing that there's only like 6 people that showed up here?
I would like, obviously, we'd like to see more people, but we also have to bear in mind that there's a tremendous torrent of disinformation. People don't know what to believe, right? And and the monopoly media, basically with their titanic, their tremendous resources, right, are able, in a sense, not to shape public perception, but to demobilize people. Because if people don't know what's going on, they're not going to go into action, right? And in a sense, it takes a tremendous amount of effort, of resource, of researchers sometimes to find out what actually is going on. So, for example, the May 25th massacre that took place in Syria, right? Okay, was it the Syrian government? Was it the forces that are opposed to the Syrian government? Was it members of the military of the Syrian government that are opposed to the Syrian government but acting in consort with the US imperialists and so forth? We didn't know, right? This was all confused. And then evidence comes out that actually indicates that it may not have been the Syrian government. That aside from itself, whether the massacre was by the Syrian government or not, that is not a pretext by which to commit a greater crime, which is intervention into Syria. But we also see that there's a significant amount of distortion. For example, when it came to Iraq, for example, over weapons of mass destruction, what has happened in Afghanistan, the disinformation that has emerged has paralyzed people. And I think that's one of the central crimes of the monopoly media today, the so-called mainstream media, is the fact that it deliberately spreads misinformation and disinformation, which paralyzes people. Hopefully, and also, there's also this idea that's perpetrated in places like Canada, that somehow Canada is separate from the rest of the world, right? That these events that take place in faraway corners of the world, right, or faraway areas of the world, don't have an impact on Canadians. So that's one of the things that we really need. These things do have an impact on Canadians, simply for the very simple fact that Canada is a multinational country, and you have people from all over the world who are here, and there are people who are from Syria, who are from the Middle East, right, who have relatives there, so it impacts on them. And if it impacts on them, they're Canadians, so it impacts on Canada. The second point is Canada is part of the world. Everybody's interconnected, and these events there will have significant impact. And more importantly, the Harper dictatorship, the so-called Harper regime, has deliberately participated in these US imperialist plans. And Canada is increasingly being more and more unraveled, entangled, for example, in this US imperialist drive for world hegemony. The tar sands, for example, in Canada, for example, in Alberta, far from just being simply an environmental issue, it's important to understand that those oil resources are being harnessed for the US war machine, right? And Canada is increasingly becoming part of that. So these things will affect us, right? And like 9/11, and what happened in the aftermath had a significant impact on Canada. The war in Iraq has had significant impact. So we have to break this idea. This is part of what the Canadian ruling class does. It's like Canada is somehow insulated from the rest of the world, right? That somehow all these flammable agents that can ignite Canada, we are somehow buffered from it. And I think this is a terrible, terrible falsehood, and we have to oppose it and so forth. And beyond that, whether Canada was directly affected or not, an injustice anywhere is an injustice that we should oppose here in Canada. And Canada should be a factor for peace. And we have to uphold international law. Canada has to get out of aggressive military alliances like NATO and NORAD. And more importantly, as I said before, Canada must actively act as a factor for peace in the world, upholding international law, opposing US imperial designs, and helping peoples in their struggles for self-determination.
Evil happens when good people do nothing.
Well, that's an important point to make. And I think this is one of the things we have to be very aware of. I think the 21st century is fraught with dangers for humanity. And I think we need to make these stands. I think it's critically important. And I think as Canadians become aware of what's unfolding, hopefully this idea that Canada is insulated from the rest of the world, but more importantly, this barricade of disinformation, this flood of disinformation that paralyzes people's opinion, confuses them, sometimes leading them to take incorrect positions that are not in accord with reality, will eventually be eroded. And eventually, as we've had in the war against Iraq, when the war against Iraq broke out, we had thousands of Canadians in the streets. When George Bush came to visit here, we had about 10,000 people in the streets opposing him. So Canadians do take stands, but sometimes you feel powerless, right? And it's also a question not only of disinformation or powerlessness. I may oppose in military intervention, but what can I do? The government will do whatever it has decided to do. They will unravel themselves in imperialist designs that I oppose, right? So what happens is people need to feel that they can empower themselves. And so we have to find ways to break this political disempowerment that exists in Canada so people can be empowered so that their will is expressed. This Harper dictatorship is basically only in power on the basis of less than 40% of the electorate that voted. Yet by the peculiarities of the so-called democratic democratic system, it's in power, right? I don't think when 60% of the people vote for another party that that this government can claim its democratic legitimacy. But it's running by fiat all sorts of incredible changes and attacks on Canada and the Canadian people through the parliamentary system, simply on the basis of the fact that through the peculiarities of the Westminster system, it has managed to seize power. And increasingly, it's acting in a dictatorial fashion. So people need to find ways of empowering themselves. We can look to Quebec, the Quebec students, for example. What they have done in basically staying in the streets for over 3 months of continual action, right, with ups and downs and so forth, right, waning and waxing. So all of these different things has been a profound impact that power can reside in the people if only we organize ourselves. So this is the big challenge, I think, for the vast majority of Canadians who want Canada to be a peacemaker, who oppose imperialist intervention, and who feel disempowered, who feel their voices and their actions mean nothing and can have no action, is to find ways by which we can empower ourselves so that Canada can become a genuine factor for peace on the world scale. These are the challenges we face, and unfortunately, the stakes are extremely high. It's the future of humanity. It's the future of our species.
Beautifully said. Thank you for that information.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. And there's other people, I think, for example, the guy with the chili hat.
Hello, sir. What's your name?
Gary Zaxman.
And can you tell us a little bit about why you're protesting against the military intervention in Syria today? Or the looming military intervention, if you want to...
Well, it's already been happening. The intervention is already taking place in the sense that it's now been even reported by the New York Times that CIA have been arming these gangs on the border of Syria, inside Turkey, to go back into Syria and cause havoc. But it's also been very clear from statements of the U.S. Secretary of State Clinton that they want what is known as regime change. The so-called change they want to take place in Syria, for all the American claims that they want democracy there, it starts with saying that Bashar al-Assad has to go regardless of the will of the Syrian people on that question. So as a Canadian who's been here for a while, for the past several decades, watching how this country has become ever more deeply embroiled in U.S. invasions, occupations, and mad schemes of empire around the globe, I can see the huge pressure that the Harper dictatorship is under to join this latest enterprise in Syria. Of course, it's going to be done under the aegis of NATO, but Canada is a full-fledged member of NATO. So whatever is done by NATO, whether it's done in Canada's name or not, embroils Canada. We do not need to be involved in any of these things, except that we have a ruling class in this country that wants privileges from the U.S., and that's why they embroil us in these things. But the issue for Canadian people is we don't want to be participating in wars like this. And we do not agree with occupation and invasion. The popularity of the Afghan invasion and occupation is zero in Canada. And it is only maintained because of the pressure from the United States that Canada has to stay there. The same thing will happen if an actual intervention is arranged into Syria. Canadian opinion at first will be claimed to be, gaga for it, but then it will turn out that no one was for it, and that the only reason it would take place is because of U.S. pressure behind it. All these schemes of empire, they have had their day. The peoples do not want to have anything more to do with this. It is absolutely clear in the Middle East what the peoples want, and the last thing they're going to tolerate is yet another Western organized occupation, invasion, insult to their life, to their values, to their history. Call it Islam, call it what you like. It is ethnocentric, it is racist, and Canadians should have no part of that. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much.
Okay.